Welcome to AI with AI, that's Artificial Intelligence with Andy Lachinsky, a podcast from CNA Talks where we discuss the latest breakthroughs and implications in artificial intelligence and autonomy. We have an email address, ai@cna.org. If you have any questions or comments, just drop us a line, ai@cna.org. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. That's cna.org/CAAI. Well, Andy, we have another special guest with us. We've got Dr. Anya Fink, who will be talking about disinformation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That will happen at the end of our notes on news and research here. So for our listeners, if you're wondering whether we're going to talk about the Zelensky deepfake video, stay tuned because that will come up in our discussion with Anya. So with that as preamble, what is the latest and greatest in artificial intelligence and autonomy?
Yeah, might as well jump into the Russia-Ukraine war. So there are a couple
Yeah.
of interesting items. So Reuters reported, we're recording this on March 22nd for timeliness.
Hmm.
On March 14th, Reuters reported that Ukraine has actually started using Clearview AI's facial recognition. Ukraine's defense ministry began using it on March 5th. As part of the Reuters story, this actually made me look to make sure that I read this right. They quoted Lee Wolosky, who they highlight as an advisor to Clearview, but was a former diplomat under U.S. Presidents Barack Obama and Joe Biden. I kind of had to look at that twice. But he's quoted as saying that Ukraine is receiving free access to Clearview's search engine. Of course, we talked about Clearview a number of times. And so the story goes that Clearview chief executive, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Haun Tan-Fat, he sent a letter to Kiev offering assistance. He did not offer the same technology to Russia.
Yeah.
So we're not quite sure exactly what they're doing, but there is a little bit of an interview that Reuters has with Ukraine's vice prime minister and digital transformation minister, Mikhailo Fyodorov. It's a simple little Q&A. So you're not going to learn too many details, but just the salient fact itself is that Ukraine is in fact using Clearview AI's facial recognition.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch over the last few weeks what sort of Western technologies have been pulled out from Russia, right? We've heard the stories about, Apple and Google and other companies and organizations pulling out support for Russia. Here's yet another example, sort of the reverse, which is a technology only being offered to
Right.
one party in this conflict.
Last week, you mentioned as part of some stories we were doing
Hmm.
on a related theme that Twitter had a thread on using open source intelligence.
Yeah.
And so just last week, Wired published a really neat piece by writer Tom Simonite,
Hmm.
where he got Wired to get kind of a free trial to a Russian service called Find Clone. And it's part of that story that you had alluded to before. So we'll provide a couple of links. It's a Twitter thread that has the handle or whatever, Tactical System Academy. You'll see lots of details, but you'll also be able to read about how Wired was able to kind of duplicate a lot of this effort and
Yeah.
what it takes and how easy it is to use open source intelligence to both kind of verify and identify people, to debunk others kind of misidentifying. It's kind of interesting. So take a look.
Yeah.
So on to other news.
Mhm.
So we talked about a couple of months ago, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he signed off on DOD's strategy for the Joint All-Domain Command and Control.
Yes.
Well, Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks signed off on the implementation plan for that strategy on March 15th. And there's both an unclassified version, which is what we'll provide a link to. It's fairly short. It's about 8 or 9 pages of text. There are a couple of other pages that don't have much information at all. There's a nice nifty graphic that kind of summarizes the whole thing. It's an
Yeah.
implementation plan, and that's
Yep.
all you'll see. It's
Yeah.
basically, this is kind of what we're going to be thinking about and doing. It's sort of organized around what loosely is kind of a John Boyd's OODA loop for those who know, the observe, orient, decide, act, although in this case, it's 3 functions: sense, make sense, and act. And the make sense part is where the AI, machine learning, and other predictive analytical technologies are going to come into play. There's very little substance. It's just a basic organization, but there is a nifty graphic that at least visually encapsulates all these various, functions that they have 5, what they call enduring lines of effort: data enterprise, human enterprise, technical enterprise, and so on. There are some very broad guiding principles. So again, not much on substance, but you can guess, and the reality is there's much more behind the scenes. For those of you interested in getting a sneak preview on the unclassified level of what the implementation plan for the strategy looks like, it is now available.
Yeah, it's a very pretty graphic that they put together that looks great in theory. So, The devil's in the details.
We come to it's a story, but it's a major report release. We've now been
Yep.
doing, you and I, these podcasts long enough that we've been around for all of the editions of the AI index. And of course, we've talked about a variety of AI indices. We did one a few weeks ago, right? But this is kind of the grandfather of them all. This is from the Stanford University Human Centered AI
Mhm.
Center. And this is the fifth edition of their index. The first one we did on our eighth podcast in the first season back in 2017.
Wow.
The latest one weighs in at about 230 or so pages. Overall, it is what it's always been. It basically is a distillation from the past year. But the beauty of this is actually not so much in the numbers, that's part of it, obviously, that summarize everything that's been happening in the last year. But the real meat of it is they provide this wonderful visual gallery of the trends that go back in some cases 10, 20 years. And all of that is in there. For this particular edition, they've expanded a little bit. They have a new technical performance chapter. They have a new survey of robotics researchers around the world.
Mhm.
They have data on global AI legislation in like 25 different countries. There's a new chapter with more in depth analysis of technical AI ethics metrics.
Mhm.
And as in the prior years, they also have an accompanying vibrancy tool. We've described it before, so we're not going to spend too much time on that. You'll see it all in the links for those interested. But it's an interactive visualization tool that kind of compares roughly 30 countries across 23 different indicators, but you can actually play around with it. You can give different weights, and it's a fairly useful glimpse into how countries are organized. It's hard to do it justice. As I
Mm.
said, the meat of it is in the graphics.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
we're relegated, unfortunately, on the podcast to just saying things in words, right? So, couple of highlights, some top level takeaways. Private investment in AI has just soared.
Mhm.
So you'll see the actual numbers. To give you an idea, in 2020, there were four funding rounds worth $500 million dollars or more. In 2021, there were 15, just as a little number.
Mm.
But it gets more interesting. US and China dominated the cross country collaborations,
Mm.
which is interesting.
Mhm.
It's increased 5 times since 2010.
Mm.
Language models we've been talking about for the last year,
Mhm.
much more capable than ever, but they're also considerably more biased. And we've talked about that, but you'll see the numbers that go with it. And ethics is everywhere.
Mhm.
It's just literally exploded. There are like over 70% more publications just on ethics focused conferences in recent years.
Mhm.
A couple of other high level takeaways: research and development. The number of AI patents filed in 2021 is more than 30 times higher than in 2015.
Wow.
The one trend that surprised me a little in a good way, the deficiency as I've seen it in the last couple of years is computers or machine learning algorithms are getting better and better at deduction, at induction, but the abductive nature of
Mm.
reasoning, right? That's still, at least what I thought, is still falling far behind the curve. It's still
Mhm.
far behind the curve, but what you'll see in the report is that as of 2019, the best abductive natural language inference engines, they were within like 9 percentage points of the best humans. That was 2019.
Mhm.
As of 2021, that gap has shrunk to a single percentage point.
Hmm.
That's impressive. I
Hmm.
mean, we're talking about abduction. By that, I mean it's machine learning that if something you know is true and there's something that you might hypothesize is true, but you're not
Mhm.
quite sure, but if it were,
Mhm.
it would provide like a stepping stone to the truth you're actually seeking or the
Mhm.
path you're trying to get to. That's abduction. That's something that's really, really hard.
Hmm.
The fact that that gap between the best machine learning algorithms and the best humans or the average humans is shrinking. That was a pleasant surprise. I
Hmm.
didn't realize that. Then they talk about ethics, lots and lots of stuff there. In terms of education, one in every five computer science students who graduated with PhD degrees in the last year were in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Not
Wow.
surprising, but you'll see the
Mhm.
numbers. And again, this is just the top level. When you look at the graphs and you look at the trends, it's
Mhm.
really, really neat. In terms of policy, listen to this: the number of AI bills that contained the phrase artificial intelligence in one way or another,
Mhm.
it grew from a very, very modest, not surprisingly, this in terms of AI years was like an infinite time ago in 2012. There were
Mhm.
two such bills in 2012.
Yeah.
There were 131 in 2021.
Wow.
Anyway, I could go on and on.
Yeah.
It is a remarkably rich report filled with the visuals. So
Huh.
I urge everybody to just go to the website, download it, and just have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, you've got a graph here that shows the number of AI publications and the fields and over time. And of course, machine learning and pattern recognition are exploding over the last decade. But I notice, interestingly, natural language processing ticks up just a slight amount, but unfortunately, linguistics ticks down.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting correlated trend to watch because we talked previously about how there are likely challenges embedded in understanding of linguistics that are going to be necessary for actually getting further along with natural language processing. So that's potentially not a trend that you want to see.
Right. So let's go to a quick research item because we want to leave some room for the interview.
Hmm.
This is work that was published on March 9th in Nature and research done by DeepMind, University of Oxford, and Athens University of Economics and Business.
Hmm.
And it really is an archaeological study. Remember a long
Hmm.
time ago, I don't remember exactly what podcast, but we talked about a program that kind of tried to reproduce ancient languages, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Well, this is kind of an offshoot of that, but it takes off on its own. It's a system called Ithic. It's a deep neural net.
Hmm.
It's designed for textual restoration, which is what the older one, and there's an earlier version of this that was called Pythia. That's probably what we talked about back in 2019. But
Hmm.
not just text restoration, geographical attribution, and even
Wow.
chronological attribution.
Wow.
And perhaps the most interesting thing to me that caught my eye to begin with is by conception, the system was designed not just to do what I've just described,
Hmm.
but it was designed to work in a cooperative, kind of collaborative way with
Ah.
the actual archaeologists
Oh, wow.
and the people who study epigraphy, the study of inscribed texts, that known as encryption. So the data set they used was something like 60,000 ancient Greek texts from the Mediterranean dating between 700 BC and the 5th century AD.
Hmm.
So they put together this huge data set. It's the
Hmm.
largest one that exists right now. And again, it had three goals in mind: to restore text and to attribute both geography and chronology. It's essentially a transformer based system, a kind of think GPT-3 like, and it parses the various data sets they had, these inscriptions, leaving out a few characters. If they didn't know anything, it would be like unknown, and they would have to figure out what it is.
Hmm.
The numbers really tell the story that, first of all, on all three levels, in terms of the ability to, just as a baseline, to see that could it actually fill in these gaps that we simply didn't know. The error rate is by far better than the ancient historians alone. But in particular, to give you some numbers, like if you just take an ancient historian and you ask, we have some text for you, can
Hmm.
you figure out what does this ancient text say?
Hmm.
The ancient historians would have a character error rate of around 60% or so,
Hmm.
and the lower, the better. The older system, the Pythia that was developed in 2019, that improves it to about 47. Ithaca on its own provides 26%, which is remarkable. But
Wow.
more importantly, when it's combined in how it was designed, as I said, it's deliberately was set up in such a way that it's meant to be worked on with an ancient historian kind of
Hmm.
collaboratively.
Hmm.
The character error rate goes down to a little over 18%.
Wow.
And it does roughly on the same level for regional attribution and for chronological attribution. From my mind, apart from the technical prowess of what it's able to
Hmm.
do, it's the fact that it is designed to work with the ancient historian that I find fascinating. We're
Hmm.
seeing more and more of this hybrid approach where you tap into the deep strength of the machine learning algorithm. It's really nice work.
It's really cool. I think when we first talked about the algorithms that were helping protein folding, many, many years
Hmm.
ago, that was one of the powerful combinations was the ability to combine a human who could maybe take care of some of the larger, big movements of things and use the machine learning to really handle the smaller adjustments at the atomic level. We seem to have kind of moved into like a desert, so to speak, of seeing good examples of these types of human machine
Yeah.
combinations. So it's really great to see something like this pop up.
Yep. And we'll conclude with two quick call outs for those interested. First, there's a major report out by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's called
Mm,
Towards a Standard for Identifying and Managing Bias in
mhm,
AI. This is very much worth a look for those interested in this very important, still developing kind of
mhm,
subfield of AI. It's almost 90 pages. And what I love is that they start off with this great taxonomy of it's not just what you would kind of expect and what I've seen almost exclusively with these kinds of things, even really nice reports. They're very simplistic definitions of what you mean by bias.
mhm,
What NIST does is it gives a really wonderful taxonomy. First of all, it organizes things around three broad categories: systemic bias, statistical bias, and human bias.
hmm,
And then it describes three broad challenges that it puts within that context on a much deeper taxonomy:
mhm,
data sets, testing, evaluation. And then it goes on to explore what the ramifications are, what the possible mitigations are.
mhm,
It also includes a lot of the public comments that were posted in response to earlier drafts of this, and it contains something close to 300 references
Wow.
on top of what they describe. It's actually a really, really important report. I hope people download it and read it. Certainly, researchers, and that's to whom it's mostly targeted.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend checking this out because I think we all too flippantly say we need to worry about bias in implementing this technology. It's a daunting topic when
Oh
you
yeah.
actually look at the sheer number of things involved with this. And this starts to really lay down a good map for helping to understand all those pieces.
And the last item is a freebie. This is thanks to Springer Verlag. It's a book of the week, open access. It's also published in a hardcover form for those of you who want to purchase it for about 60 bucks or so. But it's a free PDF. It's called Meta Learning, and it's exactly what you think it is. Subtitle Applications to Automated Machine Learning and Data Mining. We've highlighted similar books in the past, but this is completely up to date. It literally has just been published, the second edition of it anyway, February 2022, has about 18 chapters, and it talks about anything and everything having to do with using AI in the sense of trying to figure out how to enable machine learning algorithms to learn how to learn better. The audience is most definitely kind of research and graduate student level. This
Mm-hmm.
is not going to be a quick coffee read for those of you who are averse to equations and technical diagrams, but for those who know kind of a little bit about the rudiments of AI and are interested in pursuing the meta learning aspect, this is a wonderful and free source. So thank you, Springer Verlag. And now stay tuned for a great interview.
All right, we'll be back after a short break.
Hi, I'm Sawyer Judge, a research analyst and game designer with CNA's gaming program. War games and workshops are great tools for tackling our sponsors' most complex problems. We create the scenarios and the structures that enable our participants to understand how decisions made today result in possible tomorrows. We can't predict the future, but we can help you be ready for it. If you're interested in learning more about our work and how we would tailor our craft to meet your most pressing research questions, please visit our website at cna.org/wargaming.
Well, Andy, we have another guest with us from CNA's Russia Studies program to chat about the role of disinformation during the Russia invasion of Ukraine. So, welcome to Dr. Anya Fink. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Dave and Andy. I'm very excited to join you today.
All right, so for our listeners, we are recording this discussion on Tuesday, the 22nd of March at around 1:30 p.m. Eastern. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is nearing the 30-day mark. Now, earlier in the podcast, Andy and I very briefly talked about some of the technology that's finding its way into the conflict here that's going on. But why don't we start more general first? Anya, can you give us some thoughts on how disinformation as a whole has been playing out in this invasion?
Sure. So I would say the most active use of disinformation propaganda has really been in the run up and during the war, right? So as the conflict is ongoing. And I think these days it's been mostly aimed at Russian and Russian speaking audiences, right? Because of the Western bans and RT and Sputnik and some of the other companies. I would say the breadth of it is very vast. So you get it from, Russian television to Russian traditional news sources to online to there's been a lot of TikTok activity as well. I think there's been some very interesting examples with TikTok being used for kind of weaponization and TikTok actually taking measures to trying to curb that. I think there's been some evidence of activity in South America and sort of other places and regions that are sort of further away to shape the information landscape. I think the Russian government also tried to do campaigns on Twitter and Facebook before ultimately kind of deciding to ban those platforms. So I think as we've seen the landscape shift and the West and Russia making restrictions on certain things that can be posted and certain content, that has definitely sort of changed the ability of Russians to post things and changed the information landscape in Russia itself. I think US efforts really have focused on releasing intelligence findings proactively to discredit any Russian false flag operations. And so that's been a very interesting trend that we've seen from even before the war. And then these days, I would say that Ukraine really kind of controls much of the international information landscape and generally the narrative, right? We've all seen, the videos with Zelensky's address to Congress. In contrast, the Russian information landscape has really become kind of a bubble aimed at sort of shaping Russian public opinion itself or the opinions of those who speak Russian.
So speaking of Zelensky, so last week NPR, I don't know, like 6-7 days ago or so, reported that a fake and a rather heavily manipulated video showing Zelensky telling soldiers to lay down their arms, surrender the fight against Russia. So the fact that it came out and was kind of boosted on Russian social media, that's not surprising. But I guess what took me by surprise, many other people as well, is why did it take so long? Or have we missed something?
Well, I think earlier in the conflict, they've tried to kind of make claims and spread those through social media that Zelensky had actually fled Kiev, right? So there's been an effort to do that. But I am, as well as you, surprised that it took so long, as well as that the fake was of such poor quality, right? So, the Ukrainians were very quickly able to rebut it, right? Zelensky himself rebutted it. And again, we know that it mostly spread through Russian social networks. So the effectiveness of it, I think, is really questionable. And I think some have argued that it could have been potentially ultimately aimed at kind of boosting internal Russian morale. But again, we don't really know if it actually ended up doing that.
One of the things that Sam kind of both implicitly and explicitly, I guess, said was that he and others were surprised by how little we had seen in the beginning of Russian technology that was touted, like the UAVs, swarms, and so on. Do you see a similar thing here? Like you just commented on the poor quality of this. We don't quite know, right, who is responsible for this particular deep fake. But are you surprised by the lack of capability that you may have suspected before? And I don't want to put words in your mouth. So, what is your assessment as to the capability of disinformation that we're seeing from the Russian side?
Well, so I think it's probably important to say sort of what we don't know, right? And I think what we really don't know is the attribution of these things. Do we know for a fact that, the Russian military is doing any of this? Do we know for a fact that it's kind of the non-military, like the troll farms, like the IRA? Or are these kind of more private collectives of individuals doing these things? I think attribution is always really tough, right? So, for example, we know for a fact that paying people to say the same thing on TikTok, like that's been happening to promote the war. We can suspect that that's kind of some kind of coordinated activity supported by the government. But with some of these things, the attribution part is really tough, right? So we commissioned a paper last year from an information security expert who talked about sort of the culture of Russian military intelligence and kind of how they approach some of these things. And one of the things he argues that their culture is really kind of to break things. They behave like a bull in a china shop. So I think that could explain some of these things, why it's kind of such poor quality. But I think ultimately, I think the devil is in this attribution issue.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting, right? Again, like if we rewound about a month ago before this really had come to a head, and I were to put a bet on who I thought was going to control the information environment, it has not gone the way that I think I would have thought. Given Russia's past behaviors and shown demonstrated capabilities, I was certainly expecting a much stronger showing, both in the coordination and the sheer volume of it. And none of that really seems to have manifested. And in fact, I would say it's almost been the opposite in the sense that not only is Ukraine mounting a stronger information campaign, but the rest of the internet seems to be mounting behind them, right? You're seeing the generation of memes and jokes and sort of a deconstructing of the Russian narrative. And this has not gone the way that I think I would have expected. Are there any sort of key reasons that might be happening, or any sense of like how things have gotten to this point?
I mean, that's a great question. So I think the first thing we know is that it appears that, the Russian government and the Russian leadership did a really sort of poor job preparing the domestic information landscape, right? So they didn't tell people that there was
Hmm.
going to be a war. And I think they, in some cases,
Yeah.
potentially didn't even tell their soldiers that there was going to be a war and that's where they were headed. And so I think this kind of
Hmm.
early seeding of the information landscape didn't happen, I think, as we would have expected it had this been kind of a much more coordinated, much more top down significant effort to do that, to sort of prime the pump. So that's one thing. But I think
Hmm.
generally we've seen numerous kind of conspiracy theories and narrative that started in the crisis phase that have now transitioned into this phase of war, that have sought to either create a pretext, or kind of now it's mostly post hoc justification for the war. So we have seen that, and I
Hmm.
think those things have kind of amplified over time. But I think those also, surprising to me, started kind of relatively late in the crisis phase. So I think you've seen a lot of these preparations of shaping the information landscape starting maybe in December and January. So I agree with you. A
Hmm.
lot of these things have been really surprising, surprising potentially as Russian combat performance.
Now, one of the things that we talked about earlier as well was the use of open source intelligence. You have these people and organizations sort of doing their own sleuthing about what's going on here. And again, not only to try to identify, for instance, who certain Russian soldiers are, but also, again, picking apart the narratives that are being thrown out there to identify the fakes. And maybe it's should have been kind of an obvious thing in hindsight, but again, kind of a surprise to see all this rallying support come in to help deconstruct and in a sense protect the information that's being spread out there, or at least try to make it better. How is that continuing to play out, or any sense of like how that's brought us to where we are now? Is Russia trying to mount a counter to some of that narrative deconstructing that's going on?
I agree with you. There's been a very kind of effective Western government and kind of Western OSINT response to Russian efforts to promote propaganda. Right. So we've seen a lot of these Russian narratives be exposed publicly. We've seen them documented in terms of who's spreading them and on what platform and kind of the responses to that. And I think governments, where possible, have taken measures against that, right? So banning RT, banning Sputnik. And I think on the backside of that, the Russian government did a kind of a disservice to itself by also limiting a lot of these social networks and things to Russian. That also, in effect, limits the spread of its propaganda, right?
When social media and phones first started exploding on the scene, I remember a wonderful, maybe at this point apocryphal picture, but I remember in my mind's eye, like 20 years ago, there was an election of a pope, whenever that was, right? But a long time ago, way before the phones. And you have an ocean of people, and they're all looking at something, but there's an ocean of people. And then you shoot forward a dozen years, and you're in the phone era, the mobile phone era, and everybody is holding up a little phone. And it just, that phase transition happened. You can't escape it. And I'm just wondering if, we've obviously had, we do it, Russia does it, everybody does it, this disinformation campaign, right? But we exist in an era now that we're kind of loosely talking about, where you have online sleuths, right? Amateurs making use of a lot of the same tools that even nation states can use for disinformation, but kind of counter disinformation. And I guess there's no specific question except for, can you outline kind of from your point of view, first of all, is that a legitimate assertion on my part? And second of all, do you perceive this kind of happening over the last couple of years, that it's not just as hard as it is to actually do disinformation or engage in disinformation tactics in a reasonable way? And we're seeing Russia's really kind of losing the ball here. But in an era where there are so many people and so many forces and so many information sources available to counter that, is that perhaps part of the problem and the usual measure countermeasure thing? But interestingly, here, it's not the military, it's literally the civilian population kind of engaging itself within that dynamic. I know that that's a mouthful, so I'll dump it into your lap. Any thoughts, Anya?
So I think this dynamic that you outlined of civilians engaging with government disinformation is absolutely correct, right? So I think a lot of the NGOs and OSINT researchers have had time to organize since 2014, right? So a lot of these coordinated efforts that can be tracked of the Russian government to do propaganda, they're tracked simply by people who have the tools and who've become much more sophisticated over the last 8 years. In terms of doing so. But I do agree with you that this narrative of civilians in wartime trying to depict what's actually happening and countering official propaganda has been very effective and a very, very new feature of this particular landscape. I think we haven't seen a conflict on this scale in Europe for, for a very long time. And this is definitely the first conflict with social media involved in it. So yeah, I would agree with you. I think it's an interesting phenomenon.
Andy, that sort of reminds me, I think it was back in January 2010 when the earthquake hit Haiti
Hmm.
and there was that massive disaster and that rushing of global support. That was one of the first, I think, global disasters where we saw social media being a thing. And to see in real time, people trapped and being able to text or do something. Now, fast forward another decade, not only are we seeing a first major conflict in which the globe is at least watching what's going on and is now being involved and has even more powerful tools such as facial recognition tools and other things available to them to be employing and to be kind of part of this thing that is going on.
Hmm.
It's really remarkable to see. My expectations of going into this were a lot more dire. Not to say that what's going on isn't horrible and all the tragedy that's happening to the various cities as they're being besieged and all that stuff going on, but it hasn't been the complete, smear run over that I think I had thought it was going to be. So we're at, like, again, I think I said the 30-day mark or getting close to it.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
seems like some of the Russian efforts are stalling, or at least some of the efforts are taking a lot longer than anybody had originally expected. This seems like things will be going on for some time. Any thoughts on how will the different campaigns try to consolidate their gains, or what's sort of the plan going forward, or what do they need to be thinking about on kind of both sides when it comes to where the information goes from here.
Well, so I think the critical thing that the Russian government's going to be thinking about is what do you do domestically in this situation, right? Because that's really the information landscape they can try to control and they've sought to control, right? Between banning Facebook and Instagram and potentially banning YouTube, right? You've already seen the Russian domestic population try to adjust in terms of how they consume social media, right? Because a lot of them do get news through social media as opposed to the Russian television. It's a sort of generational thing for the Russians. So I think they're going to be trying to figure out how to domestically talk to the population in this environment where the war is either stalemated and they're in a situation of kind of an economic recession and economic instability, which is kind of something that Russia hasn't really experienced since the 1990s. And this sort of the younger generation of Russians certainly hasn't experienced. So the folks who are much more skilled with VPNs and kind of being able to actually access social media in the West despite the bans, their biggest effort is really going to be trying to shape the domestic information landscape as to sort of calm the population, to make sure that there are no significant large-scale protests that can challenge kind of authorities in regions or central authorities. In terms of the sort of the broader landscape of the war, that really depends on sort of what happens, right? If we're in this situation of a stalemate and there's no negotiations that are ongoing, you're going to see sort of efforts to try to get out of that potentially or to solidify the stalemate. It sort of depends on how the political goals of the conflict evolve, I would argue. But I suspect that the tide of international public opinion is really not going to change at this point. So whatever the Russian propaganda apparatus is going to do, it's not going to have any strategic effects. It might have some sort of tactical effects on the ground, but I doubt that these will ultimately win the war for them.
This has been fascinating to watch and to again see the various tools come to play and the effects that they're having or perhaps not having that we might have expected. Anya, thank you so much for being here. Any final thoughts as we wrap up, things that we might think about or look for going forward?
I would just say that keep an eye on the persistent disinformation narratives that have started, I think, before the war actually happened and are now kind of evolving and metastasizing. For example, one conspiracy theory that's been promoted through various Russian media outlets and kind of picked up on Twitter and actually ricocheting through the US information environment in certain circles has been this kind of conspiracy theories about bioweapons in Ukraine or sort of US Defense Threat Reduction Agency labs being kind of complicit in some bioweapons program in Ukraine. So creating kind of the justification or the post hoc rationalization for Russian invasion. So that's been pretty prominent. And I think what's interesting is that, this is also now metastasizing in the sense that the Chinese disinformation apparatus is also picking it up. And so both countries are kind of pushing that narrative of, US potentially being complicit in biowarfare. I think that all started with kind of allegations about COVID. These specific narratives are going to be very, very interesting to watch because I think to some extent they can also play into potential escalation dynamics, kind of military and political escalation dynamics on the ground in Ukraine. So that's kind of the big thing I would paint out. And I think earlier you had asked me about sort of the quality of the deepfake video and why it was so poor. I think the other important thing to point out is that we have seen things like there's been several synthetic characters, right? AI generated characters that have been revealed as part of the early days of the disinformation campaign. I think Twitter and Facebook ended up taking down 2 profiles of these AI generated folks who claimed to be from Ukraine, but were actually kind of pushing anti-Ukrainian discourse. And so I think looking at how the private sector is actually trying to deal with these things is really, really interesting.
Dr. Anya Fink, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to talking to you again at some future date.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
All right, well, if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. That's cna.org/CAAI. But I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords. Thanks as always, Andy. I'll see you next time.
Sounds good.